Okay, welcome back to another episode of our Leadership and Learning podcast. Once again, today we are looking at an aeroplane crash investigation and drawing parallels to business and everyday life. So most post-incident reviews sound really smart. They list failures, poor decisions, missed warnings. What they really contain is hindsight rather than any meaningful learning. So today we're going to explore a simple but powerful leadership question, and that is, before something went wrong, what did normal look like? And we're going to explore it briefly through the lens of an F-16 crash report. And Mike, as the writer of the blog, I'll hand over to you at that point to discuss the technicalities.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. I guess that's my cue. So this report talks about an accident that happened in the US Air Force in 2022, I think, over Louisiana in the sort of southern side of the continental United States. It involves two F-16s doing a routine training sortie by day, and after they've completed the bulk of their mission, they've still got fuel to spare to do some more kind of in-house training. And one of the pilots finds a light aircraft on his radar that's just in a holding pattern beneath them, just doing his own light aircraft little thing. And he decides to fly a practice intercept on this light aircraft. Now, you can do that within the rules, as it were. However, it's supposed to be specifically briefed beforehand and organized with everybody involved in knowing what's going on. And the target aircraft is supposed to follow a specific known profile. So in this particular situation, the light aircraft is not expecting an F-16 to come and start to formate on him and do an identification. Also, the F-16 doesn't know exactly what the light aircraft's doing. It turns out he's just in a kind of orbital holding pattern. But either way, this happens. The F-16, the pair of F-16s go down and do an identification profile on this light aircraft. And while they're doing this, one of the F-16s gets pretty slower than is normal for the aircraft, certainly. And they configure the aircraft appropriately to keep flying. They put extra flaps down and so on. But then when the pilot realizes that things are getting a little bit dicey, perhaps, and he wants to kind of ditch the profile and carry on or fly away and go home, he moves a switch to try and put the flaps in the right position or something like that. I don't really understand the F-16 too well, but he moves the wrong switch and the aircraft then starts to behave in a way that he's not expecting. He thinks he's in a stall and he's not far away from crashing. He thinks the aircraft's lost control flight, so he ejects and he survives, and the aircraft then crashes shortly afterwards, and everybody walks away safe and well, as it were, albeit they've thrown away a perfectly serviceable aeroplane. Now, the investigation identified several contributory factors, which we're going to come on to and dig into a bit more. And the important thing that you will emphasize again and again is, while a lot of these findings may well be technically correct, the more interesting question from a kind of leadership and learning point of view is not just looking at what actually failed at that moment during that sortie. It's what had become normal for these particular F-16 pilots, the squadron they were in, the bigger, wider organization within the United States Air Force. What had become normalized for those people before failure showed up and everything came together on that particular day.
Nice one. Thanks, mate. So, you read a lot of these accident reports, or we both do, but Mike, what tells you whether a report is actually going to generate learning rather than simply describing the outcome, as so many seem to do?
A lot of investigations in general, they're quite good at identifying facts. And with aviation, it's relatively easy to identify facts, especially if the people survive, because obviously you can have interviews. But aircraft flight data recorders enable really accurate recording of what was happening with the aircraft right up until the moment of impact. And that's great because we can actually really dig into these facts to see what actually happened. However, facts are only the start of the puzzle, because the real learning comes from understanding the context and the behaviors and the decisions that those people made at the time before the facts actually finally occurred, as it were, or at the time of the facts. What was the context and the behavior of those involved? And it's really important to remember that when you're investigating an accident, you've got hindsight. You've got 20/20 hindsight. You know what was going to happen. You know what those decisions were going to lead to. And that can really distort our interpretation of the context and the behaviors and the decisions that the people made at the time. And it's really critical with investigations that an accurate description of the facts, saying what happened to the most finite level of detail, is great, but it doesn't really help us in terms of useful learning.
It's really the starting point, isn't it? It's the building blocks of the learning, I would say.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, starting at the what and looking at what people did with hindsight that they shouldn't have done or should have been done differently, many organizations, I think especially we see in the business world, safety critical industries are growing out of this. Aviation's definitely at the forefront, but many approach undesired outcomes and bad outcomes as the failure having come from people not doing what they should have done. But to your point, often it's the system slowly drifting into a new normal. And that's where I think, this blog and this podcast has its real meat to a business application in terms of learning like the difference between how work's done and how work is imagined, adaptation and whatnot. Do you want to dive a little bit more into that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's important to consider that people have this idea in their head of, as you say, work as imagined. I want a process or an outcome to look like this. And to do that, I have to come up with some procedures. And therefore that's what we call work as prescribed. So you'll write some stuff down and you'll give those procedures, those instructions to other people, but they will interpret them perhaps in a different way to how you've intended. They will do things in a potentially different way to how you've intended. They will adapt according to the context and the situation they find themselves in. And that's going to cause frictions because they'll look at the instructions, the procedures that in themselves may have lost some translation when then the originator, came up with them. There's going to be a bit of friction there. They'll come up with some workarounds, some adaptations, and then they'll produce an outcome. And if the outcome is what they wanted, despite these adaptations and potential frictions being overcome, then even though those workarounds might not be perfect, might not be completely safe, they'll gradually become normalized and they'll get kind of accepted as acceptable behavior, fine behavior, normal behavior, and that can cause problems.
Yeah. Especially if the outcomes that they lead to are rewarded, I think. So, we're well beyond this just being an aviation story at this point. But, if the workaround is taken and it achieves objective X ahead of a timeline, and then leadership congratulates, achieving that ahead of the timeline, then you're essentially rewarding a workaround inadvertently. But then so often something goes wrong and the business then turns around, or the outcome isn't positive the next time because the context is different with the workaround, and the business or the leader turns around and says, well, you didn't follow procedure. What the hell? Yes, that's my point.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
And yeah, I guess the point that we're making here is, the behavior is not just what you have to look at, but what motivated that behavior and really driving to understand how it became routine in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. You have to dig deeper. It's difficult. I do understand that. But if you really want to learn, then you have to understand how things became routine in the first place. That's the key to it all.
Yeah. And so linking it back to this report, then it says people failed to identify unsafe practices. What's the deeper story there, Mike?
Yeah, great. I mean, that's the final thing. Great. People fail to identify unsafe practices. Doesn't really help because these unsafe or risky practices, they don't generally start off life as reckless. People don't generally go out to behave recklessly. They begin as these small adaptations where people are taking shortcuts, adaptations, the way to try and get around these little frictions in the system between the workers prescribed and the outcomes they want to actually achieve. And again, what that leads to is, as long as you have success, then whether it be internally or externally from your bosses, your superiors, those successes will make it look like, potentially subconsciously, that what you're doing, these adaptations, are working, and that all feeds into normalizing the behavior. So the real key thing to sort of consider there is that when something works again and again repeatedly, it just stops looking risky. It stops feeling risky or unsafe, and it starts looking sensible and normal, and that can become a problem. And these unsafe practices, if they don't have bad outcomes, they start to look normal, and they will become accepted and potentially rewarded over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And a key term from the safety lens, I guess, here is the normalization of deviance, which is essentially what we're describing here.
Yeah.
And otherwise described as drift. And we've touched on it in other podcast episodes. But I think then to make that slightly more tangible to the corporate leadership perspective, think about a procedure that's in place in your own workplace, a CRM system, for example, but then you discover that your sales team are circumventing the CRM system, or there's coordination happening outside of official channels. For example, I've seen this one before. There's an official channel set up, but the coordination starts happening in WhatsApp because it's just faster and easier, and the teams get the answers they need. And then suddenly they're slammed for official records not being maintained. Ultimately, we're just talking about basically shortcuts being made to meet targets, but again, when you have this undesired outcome, you can either turn around and blame the individual and be like, you didn't follow a procedure. The procedure is clearly written here. Bad news, slap on the wrist, retrain or ship them off. Or look at, as we've said, what motivated that behavior. And if the workaround is being conducted widely by, everyone or many people, then it's probably not a people problem, but it's probably a problem with the design of the system.
There's a good little segue there with when Sidney Dekker talks about a just culture. One of the sort of key test questions that he asks is, has this happened to the same person more than once or more than one person? And if it has, then that's a quite easy avenue to go down where it says this is almost certainly a system problem, not an individual problem.
So one for our listeners to ask themselves or their teams, and that's, what is one workaround that's being used regularly in your work because of a clunky official process? And that can be somewhere to start refining and understand what is driving the workaround.
Yeah, definitely. Ask that question of your teams, see what answers you get, because that's where the learning is going to start. That's where you're going to get some real valuable learning opportunities. It might well be a course of innovation where you discover the process isn't working properly. Let's innovate, let's change, let's do something differently. Or it might be a case of that the process needs to be stuck to because of reasons that perhaps people don't see all the time. So yeah, that's where the real learning comes in. Ask the questions, get the answers, take it from there.
Totally. Okay, moving on. One phrase that stood out, a classic one, routine violation. So it was violated, it was routine. Mike, if it's routine and widespread, what's that really telling us?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if something is both routine and widespread, it's no longer really a violation. It's part of your workplace's culture. It's not rogue behavior by a few bad apples individually. We've got this. There's lots of words, lots of different languages I can use to sort of talk about this concept. But when you have your formal procedure, workers prescribed, as it were, and then you've got your real work, which is what we call, work as done, you're going to have some overlap just based on reality. And due to operational pressures, whether that be financial time, resources, those kind of things, teams are going to adapt to deliver the outcomes, because those are the ultimate end games, the priorities that people are trying to get to. And these written procedures that people come up with, that organizations come up with, that you and I have dealt with a lot through flying military airplanes, they describe ideal work. But the ideal work is contextualized through an ideal lens. And when you have real work, real world conditions, real pressures, or potentially perceived pressures, that's going to affect things. Written procedures, they describe ideal work. Real work happens with real external pressures or internal pressures that can actually affect things. And it's key to consider the friction between those two and how you can actually learn from them.
Absolutely. One little example that comes to mind, one of our listeners actually wrote into us a couple of months ago on a similar topic and described, he works in firefighting in the US. And you might recall, Mike, he was talking about that the procedure says that they should all be wearing their seatbelts.
Yeah.
While they're, hooning around, sirens on to get to the firefight, which makes sense. But they were finding that it was actually slowing them down with all their kit on, both getting into the truck and getting out to actually fight the fire. And so there was this routine violation whereby nobody's wearing seatbelts. And I think that's just a classic example of, it's the people, on the shop floor at the forefront trying to achieve their mission, their outcome, and therefore putting workarounds in place because they're, in this case, so motivated to get that outcome. So that's kind of a procedural design flaw potentially or whatever. I think the other thread that I'll pull from that is for leaders who are designing KPIs or key performance indicators for their teams, thinking really hard and long about what are these second order effects of this KPI? What is it going to reward and what behavior is going to be motivated to achieve that KPI? And that's often where the real work and the gap between ideal work and real work can start to divulge.
I'm looking at that gap, where it's come from, what's put it in place. And going back to the firefighting example, which is a great one, I've had this conversation quite a few times with people, that the firefighter's mental model is, I need to get to this fire as quickly as possible, and a seatbelt is slowing me down, therefore I'm not going to put my seatbelt on. The consequences, the real lived consequences on occasion has been that the fire engine has had an accident on the way to a fire, and firefighters have been severely injured, and I think in a couple of cases potentially killed because they haven't been wearing their seatbelts. But if you look at that outcome as a leader, as an external inspector or whatever, and you just look at the non-compliance of they weren't wearing the seatbelt, that's bad. We need to look deeper. What's stopping them wearing their seatbelts? They want to get to the fire quicker. Okay, well, we need to do a bit more education, perhaps focus on what's important. They've firefighters have got to look after themselves first because they have to make sure they get to the fire safe so they can actually do their jobs properly. But they've really got to look at the whole thing there. You can't just focus on compliance. You've got to look at what's causing that work to not get done as the work is imagined. Look at those frictions, look at these adaptations and see what you can improve as a system, whether it be education, training, engineering fixes, redesigns to actually try and achieve better outcomes.
It's exceptionally rare that someone turns up to work actively wanting to not do a good job or do their best job. And so I think, a key theme we're discussing here is probing what made sense to them at the time and why did it make sense, not that was the wrong thing to do it better next time.
Yep, definitely.
So a tool that our listeners can use then in terms of, I guess, diagnosing these things ahead of time to bring them to light before they have negative outcomes is ask yourself and your team, where are people regularly bypassing official processes here? And what is the friction that's making that bypass attractive? And are we as the leaders quietly and inadvertently perhaps rewarding that shortcut? And that can reveal some pretty powerful learning, I suspect.
Yeah, definitely. Those are the key questions to ask. Because, as I said a few minutes ago, but to emphasize, if leaders only focus on the compliance and the rules and don't look at how work's actually getting done, then real learning gets lost.
Yep. Now, speaking of real learning, reports also often say that's the wrong decision. But those decisions happen with a finite amount of information that they have at the time, not with the benefit of the hindsight of the person who's saying it was the wrong decision. So, Mike, let's just pull that thread a little bit further, I suppose, and what can leaders actually look at instead when they're trying to work out what caused something to go wrong?
Yeah, hindsight's great, isn't it? But in reality, and at the time, people don't necessarily have all the information. People rarely have all the information. Your awareness is perfect with hindsight. At the time, often not the case. So you have to look at what information they had, why they had only that information. Are they under time pressure? Pretty common. Are their expectations different to what would have been expected for what was expected by the management, perhaps the individuals versus the teams? What was their mental model? Where were they focused at the time? Because it's really easy to say you should have looked at that, or I would have paid attention to this. But again, hindsight affects our judgment an awful lot. We have to dig into why people's attention was focused in a particular area at the right time, because people tend to almost always choose what they think is going to be the best option at the time. They don't generally make a bad decision with good awareness. They make a good decision with bad awareness. So they pick what they think is the best option at the time.
Yeah, nice. I think a perhaps overly reductive analogy that I found quite useful is I think everyone has been in that situation, driving somewhere you're a little bit unfamiliar with, and you're thinking, do I take this exit or the next one? Is it this exit or the next one? I'm not quite sure. And then you take that exit and lo and behold, it ends up being the wrong exit, as it were. It's not the one that gets you most efficiently to where you were trying to be. And the analogy then is after the fact being the person with the map and being like, well, you're an idiot. You took the first exit when clearly I can see here that the second exit was the right way to go. And it's a little bit reductive, but maybe not that much compared to some of the reports that we read.
No, I mean it's quite a simple example, but again, people make decisions based on their mental models at the time, when we have to dig into why those mental models are the way they are.
Totally.
Otherwise, we don't learn.
And bring it back to business. We often see people look back and say, well, that was the wrong call. But the real question is, what made it seem like the right call at the time? So lo and behold, Mike, we're going to come back to debriefing, which we love to do, but again, from a slightly different lens today. So I would say to listeners out there, when you're next doing a retrospective, a debrief, or looking back at something and trying to work out what can be improved or replicated, ban the phrase, they should have known XXX for the first 10 minutes or more, and instead start asking, what were they seeing? What was the information they had at the time? What did they believe at that time was happening? And what options seemed to be available to them? And what was the pressure that they were under? And it's putting yourself back in our analogous car and going back to the moment just prior to the exit when there's a truck behind them, tailgating them. They need to make a decision rapidly and understanding the information that was available to them at that time. And that's how you learn how decisions are really made. And you're going to learn so much more about your system there than just going, well, Muppet, you took the wrong exit. Let's move on. Yeah. So that leads us into the final part. In keeping with our hindsight bias kind of lens here, the report then says, hey, we jumped in the simulator and actually the aircraft was recoverable at that time. But that, of course, doesn't actually mean that the pilot could recognize that it was recoverable at the time, nor know exactly how to deal with it. So again, a useful piece of information, but not all that useful for organizational learning.
Yeah, I mean, when I read this section of the report, like it actually occupies quite a lot of text. There's almost like a 3/4 of a page, I think, of A4 that talks about this particular finding where they discovered the aircraft was technically recoverable if only the pilot had made the right switch selection. And I mean, it's interesting. It's like, oh, okay, the aircraft can fly in these conditions. Brilliant. But it doesn't really help us learn because we haven't gone back to why the pilot made the decision that they did, why they made the switch selection they did, why they then acted in the way that they did when they got the indications that they had, et cetera, et cetera. And you've got this kind of, big picture difference between physics, how aeroplanes fly, the computers that fly them, aerodynamics, etc., and the human that's in control of the aeroplane and their cognition. There's definitely a big difference between those two things. And as the human, when things happen, we have what you might call a recognition window where we'll take in our senses will be stimulated, as it were, by what's going on. We'll see things, we'll hear things, we'll feel things, and then we will react according to what we think those things mean. But if in this particular case, the pilot moved a switch, and then as soon as he moved the switch, the aircraft started to shudder quite aggressively, that would mean, certainly to me, and probably to you, Sam, that the aircraft is in a position of stall. And when you're stalling quite close to the ground and you're quite slow, that's not very good. So these cues are obviously a little bit ambiguous, and there's no real digging into that in the report. And your workload could be a factor as well. We've talked about external pressures, time pressures, things like that. That's a condition of what's going on here as well. When your workload starts to ramp up, that narrows your attentional model. It stops you being able to dedicate time to, it might take you one or two extra seconds to make sure you've definitely got the right switch before you move it. But in reality, humans don't work like that. Like, we'll make these little mental shortcuts, these mental workarounds, these adaptations all the time. And that can catch us out. So the real key thing to bear in mind when you read things like this is the physics, while interesting, it tells us what's possible. But if you want to learn, you've got to look at the human factor because that tells us what's probable.
So this is a good segue just to look at why we use aeroplanes, and particularly aeroplane crashes, I suppose, in this context, so frequently in our workshops and in our podcasts and our blogs and whatnot, because the feedback loop between culture, context, environment, and its impact on the human and the actions they take and the reaction of the system to that action is so finite and so visible because it's so tangible, I suppose. But it's so analogous to business processes at a larger scale, I think. And, many businesses or business processes are recoverable on paper. It's like, yes, theoretically, we should be able to achieve the project, the KPIs on time. We should be able to maintain or build our client base by X% by time. But often the people in them are too overloaded or recognizing key indicators too late to actually recognize the problem. And something we spoke about in kind of our planning of this podcast, Mike, was essentially the sunk cost fallacy that you mentioned here, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
When we don't, it's a bit of a tangent, I suppose, but let's talk about a failing project. With hindsight, we've looked at it and gone, well, we lost so much more money on that than we had to. We could have pulled out or changed course months prior. But at the time, again, like, what are the KPIs? The people in it are just working so hard to achieve the job on the day. They've already invested so much effort and time, and they just keep trying to optimize, work around, and achieve the goal that they are attentionally focused on one area and perhaps missing the bigger picture. They're too overloaded to recognize the cues that are, while available, sure, maybe not obvious to them. And that direct analogy is back to our pilot in the cockpit. There were cues that told him that the plane would have been flyable, but there were also some very, very strong cues telling him that the plane wasn't flyable, and he stepped out. Did you want to add anything to that?
I think I was just going to, another thing for the sunk cost fallacy is this is why Las Vegas makes loads of money out of gamblers, because you lose money and you risk losing a bit more on the chance that you might win some, and then you risk losing even more on the chance that you might win some more. That's kind of how it's a well documented and understood facet of the human brain, but it can really catch us out. And when it comes to money, that really does start to drive the emotional side of our brain, which can have real impacts. And businesses ultimately are all about making money, so it's a thing for leaders to consider.
Totally. And so I think kind of the core thing we're getting at there is for leaders or managers or whoever's listening to stop and think, what are the early warning signs in our organization that could be easy to miss when something's going either on a kind of off direction or off target, or investing too much money in it, for example. And that's where we spoke about a tool that we used in the airplanes was decision gates. It's like, if I haven't achieved X outcome by time Y, it's not necessarily a time to throw it in the bin, but it's a time to reevaluate. And we would use that a lot in our mission planning.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's the real key thing is, while you've got these early warning signs that we talk about, you have to look at ways to make those signals easier to recognize and then have clearer decision gates to actually hold yourselves to account as leaders and teams such that you can actually make the right decision.
Totally. Nice. All right. So bring it all back to our core point then. For you as a leader, whether looking forward at what might go wrong or back at what did go wrong or didn't go as we wanted it to, the question isn't just what failed, but it's what had become normal at the time of failure. And that's going to expose any shortcuts that became routine, some of those signals that, with the benefit of hindsight, could have been seen, and maybe next time we can make them much more obvious, and behaviors that have become to feel normal, either knowingly or not, internally, but then have unintended consequences, I guess, externally. Leaders will often look back, especially after an undesired outcome, and inspect for compliance when it's far more powerful to inspect for what was normal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a key thing. I mean, normal is hard. To dig into what is normal, why things have become normal, that's hard. That takes time, that takes resources. Compliance is easy. You can look at a rule and you can quite easily measure, has that rule been broken by one person, two people, 10 people, whatever. But that doesn't help real learning. If you really want to look at preventing bad outcomes, whether they be safety outcomes, financial bad outcomes, whatever, you have to put some effort into being curious about what goes on in everyday normal work.
Absolutely. Okay, so some practical takeaways for our listeners then. If you are leading a team, try these 3 questions this week. Send us a DM or comment on LinkedIn or wherever on perhaps the general vibe of what was revealed, if not the specifics. So number 1, ask yourself and your team, what workarounds are we currently relying on? Where do our written processes differ from what we actually do? And what signals do we routinely ignore because nothing bad has happened yet?
Yep, definitely. If you don't understand normal and why things are normal, then we're just going to keep describing accidents and incidents while actually learning very little and changing. You have to look at what normal behavior is. What can you change? What can you adapt? What can you make better and improve such that normal behavior becomes what you want and you don't have the outcomes that you don't want?
Yeah. Stop reacting to surprises and rather take the short-term pain for the long-term gain of preventing reacting to them. Excellent. Thanks, Mike. And keep an eye out for our next podcast.